Hey guys, tonight we venture into the cold, gray heart of 17th-century Puritan New England, a place where the wind rattles wooden shutters and every footstep on the cobbled path seems to echo through the moral fabric of the town. The streets are lined with timber-framed houses, their windows shuttered their chimneys, wheezing out pale ribbons of smoke. A bell tolls from the meeting house calling the godly to prayer. You trudge along behind them, bundled in wool shoes, damp with morning frost. And you'd better not sneeze in there. Yes, you can get fined for that. This was a world built on rigid codes and relentless order, where every waking moment was measured against Scripture, and every decision from how you laced your bodice to whether you hummed while sweeping could land you in hot water, or more precisely in the stocks right there in the middle of town next to the suspiciously judgmental geese. You probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you're listening. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step across the creaky threshold of this peculiar world, and the door closes softly behind you. You're standing in Massachusetts Bay Colony, probably in Boston or Salem. It's the early 1600s, and everything smells faintly of wood smoke, old bread, and mild desperation. The Puritans, your new neighbors, have fled England to escape what they saw as a dangerously lax Church of England. But here's the twist: they didn't want freedom of religion for everyone. They wanted freedom to enforce their religion right down to what color socks you were allowed to wear on a Thursday. The moment you arrive, you get that tight feeling in your chest, like when someone starts a group text about voluntary chores. People here watch. They know when you leave your house how many times your chickens cluck on a Sunday, and what direction you were facing when you sneezed during a sermon. Did you face East Sussex or Pagan? You follow the crowd toward the meeting house. It doubles as a church and a town hall, because naturally, governance and God are all mixed together here. It's cold inside, poorly lit, and there's a man up front with a beard so aggressive, it looks like it could give a sermon on its own. He reads scripture while pacing slowly, like he's daring anyone to blink too fast. There are rules here. So many rules. Don't sleep during church. Don't cough too loudly. Don't smile. And whatever you do, don't be a woman who speaks out of turn. That's practically a capital offense. Historians still argue whether the Puritans were genuinely trying to build a moral utopia or just had a weird obsession with keeping other people from dancing. You shuffle into a pew. There are no cushions. Of course there aren't. Cushions would imply comfort. Comfort breeds sin. You sit with your back straight and your hands folded. Someone nearby whispers a prayer too quickly. A deacon glances in their direction. Uh-oh. You think about yawning. Just thinking it feels illegal. This is your first brush with the Puritan mindset, and it sets the tone for everything else they believed in: strict moral discipline, self-restraint, and the literal word of the Bible as civil law. In other words, no, you can't sleep in on Sunday. No, you can't sing unless it's a psalm. No, you can't wear that hat. It looks a little too worldly. You're handed a pamphlet by a very serious woman with a wooden face. It's a list of fines, like a menu of things you shouldn't do. Missing church service, 1 shilling. Arriving late, half a shilling. Talking during service, 2 shillings. Laughing, 3 shillings and a lecture. Falling asleep stocks, with bonus public humiliation. Yes, the town actually pays a designated man called a tithing man to walk around during the sermon and poke sleepyheads with a stick. One end is soft for waking ladies. The other has a feathered knob used to gently but firmly bop men back into consciousness. Equal opportunity harassment. Oddly enough, there's some debate over whether this tithing stick was also used outside of church, maybe at town meetings or during court. Historians still argue whether its presence was purely symbolic or if it evolved into a kind of early Puritan cattle prod. You leave the meeting house after hours of rigid silence. The door creaks open and the daylight slaps your eyes. You survived, but just barely. Outside, people move with purposeful awkwardness, like they're trying not to provoke God. It's a miracle anyone here ever cracked a smile. Now you're taken to the common house by your new host family, a grim-faced couple who have already apologized to you twice for owning curtains. Apparently, they're worldly. You smile and say it's okay, but they still look vaguely ashamed. At dinner, you're offered a small bowl of cornmeal mush. It's lukewarm. So is the conversation. The man of the house frowns at his own child for fidgeting and quotes Leviticus at her. You almost laugh, but stop yourself just in time. The woman across the table notices anyway and narrows her eyes. You quickly change the subject. So, what's the worst crime around here? She stirs her mush eyes, never leaving you. Missing church. You nod, trying to look appropriately horrified. Later, they show you your room, a drafty loft above the main space with a rope-strung bed and a single threadbare blanket. There's no candle, no books. Just you, the shadows, and the sound of a cat trying to cough up a theological debate. As you settle in, you hear a distant bell ring again. That's the 8:00 p.m. curfew. It's illegal to be out past that without a good reason. You imagine someone being arrested for a suspiciously long walk with a goat. You shiver and pull the blanket tighter. Here's a strange detail that's almost too bizarre to believe. Some towns required all household lights to be out by 9:00 p.m. Unless, of course, you were studying the Bible. That got a pass. Candlelight for Corinthians. Totally fine. Candlelight for literally anything else. That's Lucifer's hour. And yes, there were inspectors. The local constables sometimes did late-night patrols to check windows. If they saw a flickering light at 9:01 p.m., you'd better have been mid-Galatians or preparing your soul for judgment. You wonder how many of them pretended to squint in holy confusion when they were really just finishing a spicy chapter of Gulliver's Travels. This tension between the sacred and the everyday is everywhere. It infects the air. It makes your spine stiffen every time someone sighs too loudly. The Puritans believed the devil was just waiting to sneak into their lives through music, color, laughter, and leisure, so they built a society designed to stamp out those things. Was it effective? Kind of. Was it joyful? Absolutely not. But what's truly fascinating and a little tragic is that many of these laws weren't passed because people were constantly breaking moral codes. They were passed to prevent the temptation from even entering the town. In short, the idea was, let's outlaw anything fun before someone thinks about trying it. That's how you get situations where children were punished for playing games, adults were fined for walking too slowly on a Sunday, and everyone lived in a constant state of anxious self-policing. There's a story possibly apocryphal, but deliciously ironic about a man who was so afraid of appearing impious that he refused to attend his own daughter's wedding because it fell too close to the Sabbath. The marriage went ahead without him. The town approved. The daughter never spoke to him again. Historians still argue whether this kind of self-denial made Puritan towns more holy or just made people very good at pretending. As the night deepens, you lie awake in your lumpy bed, staring at the wooden beams above. Every creak of the house feels like a potential accusation. You think about all the things you'd normally do on a quiet night: read, hum, stretch, scroll, Instagram. Every one of those would probably land you in moral jail here. Even dreaming feels suspicious. You finally drift off to sleep, but not before promising yourself to tread even more carefully tomorrow. After all, the Sabbath is coming, and you still haven't figured out whether breathing too rhythmically during a hymn is a punishable offense. You wake to the sound of roosters and judgment. The early light spills through slatted windows and cuts across your face like a theological accusation. Today is the Sabbath. You've already broken at least 2 rules by thinking about breakfast and blinking out of sync with the sunrise. As you sit up, the boards creak too loudly. Someone in the house coughs. The tension is immediate. You must be quiet. You must be reverent. You must not, under any circumstances, whistle. You shuffle downstairs to find your host family already fully dressed, stiff as fence posts, seated around the breakfast table. The food cold. Why? Because cooking is illegal on the Sabbath. Even reheating is sketchy. If you wanted a warm meal, you should have made it yesterday because Sunday is for souls, not stews. You spoon a lump of grayish corn mush into your mouth. It tastes like divine obligation. Outside, the town moves in a soft, eerie hush. Doors don't slam. Feet don't stomp. Even the horses seem to clop a little more reverently. This is where the Puritan blue laws come into play, named not for the color, but perhaps for the somber, bruised feeling they inspire. These laws were designed to protect the sanctity of the Sabbath, and they covered everything. No work, no play, no noise, no pleasure. You couldn't kiss your spouse. You couldn't sweep the floor. You couldn't comb your hair too aggressively. If it looked like effort or joy, it was probably banned. You step outside instinctively quiet and notice two men walking just ahead. One reaches to pat the other on the back, maybe a brief gesture of camaraderie. His hand never lands. They remember the rules. In some towns, even traveling more than a mile from your home was considered a crime. You could go to church and back, and that was about it. Venturing farther was considered a Sabbath-breaking offense, and local authorities would fine you. Or worse, call you in front of the church elders for a tongue lashing that made your shoelaces feel guilty. Historians still argue whether these limitations were actually enforced as strictly as the laws suggest, or if they function more like ever-present threats, legal scarecrows to keep people obedient. You see a woman hurrying across a field shawl clutched tightly. She glances back when someone's watching her. Her foot catches a root, and she stumbles, nearly falling. She mutters something. Uh-oh. If that was a curse, even a mild one, she might be facing a fine and a lecture tomorrow. Even today, remnants of these blue laws exist in parts of America. Have you ever wondered why liquor stores are closed on Sundays in some towns, or why buying a car is oddly difficult on a Sunday afternoon in certain states? Thank the Puritans. Their shadow is long, their paperwork eternal. Back in town, you see the Sabbath wardens making their slow, self-important rounds. These men are the Sunday police appointed to enforce moral behavior. They carry long staffs and occasionally stop to question people. Where are you going? Why are you walking so fast? What's that in your hand? If it's anything other than a Bible or a particularly pious piece of bread, you're in trouble. A young boy gets flagged for running too enthusiastically to church. It's not dignified. He's forced to walk back slower under the gaze of a warden who seems personally offended by the concept of youth. And if you think you can sneak in a little fun after sundown, maybe a chat with friends or a game of jacks by candlelight, think again. Blue laws don't magically disappear when the stars come out. Sunday lasts until midnight. That's 16 hours of mandatory solemnity. And you better not be caught whistling. Yes, whistling was illegal on the Sabbath in many towns. It was too close to worldly joy. You enter the meeting house again. The sermon begins. Today's topic, the sinfulness of secret cheer. Subtle. You zone out for a moment and your eyelids droop, then tap. The tithing man again. Feather end this time. He raises an eyebrow. You straighten up. Hours pass. People around you shift uncomfortably, cough discreetly. One woman sneezes. Not just any sneeze, a loud one. Multiple heads turn. She buries her face in her kerchief. Someone whispers, "She sneezed out of pride." You're not sure what that means, but you write it down in your mind anyway. After the service, people disperse slowly, stiffly. No one smiles. Even the children walk like they've been sent to detention by God himself. You trail behind a group of them as they walk home. One dares to draw a smiley face in the dirt with a stick. The others freeze. They look around, no warden in sight. But then an old woman peers through a curtain and frowns. The stick drops. The smiley face is kicked into oblivion. You pass a house where a man is sitting motionless on his porch, eyes closed, face tilted slightly toward the sun. His wife bursts out the door and hisses, "You look too comfortable." He immediately starts reciting Psalm 51. Here's a fringe tidbit for you. In some communities, wearing bright colors on Sunday was considered vain and suspicious. Earth tones were safest, gray, brown, black, and that one shade of beige that practically screams, "I do not dance." Anything with color could be interpreted as prideful. And pride leads to dancing, and dancing leads to Satan's disco. The correlation may be flimsy, but the laws weren't. You stop at the edge of the village green, where a young couple is sitting awkwardly at least 3 feet apart. Their chaperone, a plump old aunt with a stare that could curdle milk, sits between them knitting. Not for warmth, just for tension. They aren't talking, just sitting, silently. They've been courting for 6 months and haven't touched hands. Why? Because physical affection on the Sabbath is blasphemous. And in this town, even glancing too long counts as foreplay. You head back to your host family's home for the evening meal. Once again cold, no candles, no songs, just solemn chewing. Someone mentions the sermon. The youngest child misquotes it. Her father makes her stand and re-recite the correct verse. It takes 5 tries. She doesn't cry. You do a little. Later upstairs in your room, you hear muffled sounds from outside. You sneak to the window and peek. A teenager is being scolded for drawing a horse in the dirt with a stick. The shape is crude but suspiciously joyful. Two Sabbath wardens confiscate the stick. The teen is marched home. You wonder if stick scribbling is a misdemeanor or a felony. There's a silence that hangs over the town as midnight nears. You feel it pressing against the windows, a moral curfew enforced not just by law, but by every neighbor's sideways glance. It's not just about what you do. It's about what you might be tempted to do, and the fear of even appearing sinful is more effective than any written law. At long last, the clock strikes 12. Sunday is officially over. A dog barks once as if testing the waters. Another replies. Somewhere a man coughs with reckless abandon. The air relaxes by a millimeter. You lie back in bed, utterly exhausted, not from doing too much, but from doing nothing with extreme caution. The blue laws were designed to preserve the holiness of the Sabbath, but in practice they created a society where silence and stillness weren't signs of peace. They were signs of terror management. The idea that God might be watching every blink and worse, so might your neighbor. Historians still debate how much of this was sincerely believed and how much was performative virtue signaling in a world with no privacy and eternal consequences. Maybe the old man who sat perfectly still on the porch was communing with the divine, or maybe he was just trying not to get sighted. Either way, you've survived your first full Puritan Sunday. Congratulations! You'll now be fined for smiling about it. You wake up to the clang of a distant bell and the creak of a floorboard that definitely wasn't yours. It's Monday now, and the rules have shifted. A little. You can talk. You can move. But don't get too comfortable. This isn't a vacation. This is 17th century Puritan New England, and joy is still under investigation. Today's focus: church attendance. Not just a spiritual suggestion, but a legal requirement. That's right. You aren't invited to church here, you're summoned. And skipping it isn't just frowned upon, it's criminal. You could be fined, publicly scolded, or even put in the stocks for pretending to have the flu too many Sundays in a row. You dress quietly, nothing flashy, obviously. Your shoes creak, and you make a mental note to apologize to the cobbler later. Outside, the village buzzes with restrained movement. People are trudging to the meeting house, which is both the church and the town hall. Multi-use buildings are all the rage when you're short on lumber and long on religious guilt. You join the crowd. No one makes small talk. Even the birds keep their chirping discreet. You hear someone sniff and whisper, 3 services today. You internally groan. That's about 8 hours of seated virtue. As you settle onto the hard wooden bench, no cushions allowed. Comfort is a gateway. Sin, you notice the seating arrangement. It's not random. Oh no. In fact, it's a deeply symbolic pecking order. Men on one side, women on the other. Elders in front, younger folks in the back. And then there's the back row, the one reserved for the unbaptized, the socially suspect, or people who once laughed at a funeral. You're in the newcomer zone, between the woman who smells like pickled onions and the man who won't stop humming psalms under his breath. And then the real treat begins: the roll call. That's right, they take attendance. A deacon literally reads out the names of every adult member of the congregation. If you don't answer or you cough suspiciously during someone else's name, eyebrows rise. There are no excuses. A blizzard might get you a pass. Barely, but a sore throat. That's just Satan testing your resolve. And don't even think about skipping to sleep in. In Massachusetts Bay Colony, you could be fined 5 shillings for absence without sufficient cause. That's about a day's wages gone because you decided to snooze instead of listen to the Reverend read from Leviticus for 90 minutes. Historians still argue whether the roll call method was genuinely meant to encourage attendance, or if it doubled as a sort of passive-aggressive census. Either way, no one escapes. Today's sermon is fire and brimstone with a touch of despair. The minister is passionate like a man trying to scare raccoons off his roof. He thunders on about sloth and how skipping church once opens a door to drinking, dancing, and eventually collapsing into the arms of a foreigner with suspiciously nice shoes. You shift in your seat. The man next to you passes gas and no one reacts, because reacting is also sinful. During the second sermon, your mind wanders. That's dangerous, because in some towns, not paying attention during the service was also punishable. Tithing men would stroll the aisles watching for drooping eyelids or wandering gazes. Some carried long poles with a feather on one end and a knob on the other. Feather for the ladies, knob for the men. Sleep at your peril. You remember that from Sunday vividly. One particularly bizarre law you overheard someone whisper about. In certain towns, it was illegal to sit with your spouse in church. Why? Because marital proximity might distract you from divine contemplation. And because in Puritan logic, love is beautiful, but also suspicious. You might whisper, you might giggle, you might, God forbid, touch knees. You watch a man try to shift closer to his wife who is seated across the aisle. A tithing man spots the movement and clears his throat. The man snaps back like he's been hit with cold water. After the third sermon, which is mostly a warning about false piety, you're released not to eat. Not yet. First comes the post-service observation period. People linger. They nod solemnly. Some quietly discuss the sermon's finer points, though rarely with smiles. Anything resembling joy could be mistaken for sarcasm. And sarcasm, that's spiritual rebellion. You overhear one man say, "The minister was clear idleness is the devil's blanket." His friend replies, "Then I'll sleep in the hay tonight." They laugh. Just once. Short and dry. Like a joke written by a turnip. Later that afternoon, you learn about the church membership process. You assumed going to church was enough. Oh no. If you want to be a full member of the church, the kind who can vote own land or scowl righteously at others, you need to give a conversion narrative. Basically, a public speech detailing your personal journey from sin to salvation. It needs to be specific, emotional, and make at least one elder cry. If you flub it or sound too confident, they might reject you. And then you're stuck in theological limbo, attending church, but not really in the church. It's like being at a party where you're only allowed to stand near the snacks, but never take any. One poor man finally stands up after weeks of preparation. He opens his mouth, starts with "My sins began early," and then bursts into tears. The elders nod. That's the stuff. Guilt is the ultimate credential here. And here's the quirky side note of the day. In some villages, dogs were banned from attending church, because apparently even animals needed to respect the Sabbath. One 1670s ordinance declared that any dog found in the meeting house would be whipped or fined. Fined. As in someone was expected to pay for the dog's crime. Historians still debate whether this applied to cats, or if cats, as usual, were simply above the law. By evening, your legs ache from all the standing and sitting and kneeling. You've absorbed over 5 hours of sermon and at least 12 individual guilt metaphors. Your brain is swimming in original sin. You crave anything fun. Too bad. Because church doesn't end at the door. Religious oversight committees meet during the week. Their job, investigate church absences, doctrinal slips, or suspicious behavior. They might visit homes and ask questions like, "Why did your child seem distracted during last Sunday's reading of Job? There's no right answer. Only degrees of wrongness." This form of surveillance creates a culture of spiritual self-policing. Children monitor parents, parents report neighbors, neighbors report back. And somewhere in the middle, your conscience has anxiety. As night falls, your host explains that tomorrow is a fast day, not for health, for repentance. No food, minimal talking, and lots of prayer. It's scheduled regularly to cleanse the community, like a spiritual purge minus the masks and machetes. You try to feign enthusiasm. Fasting sounds holy. He nods gravely. And extremely digestive. You go to bed with an empty stomach, a sore backside, and the faint memory of that one tithing man who caught you looking at the rafters instead of the pulpit. He knows. They all know. In this town, attending church isn't just a duty. It's a legal, social, and moral obligation. The sermon never truly ends. It echoes in the silence of the streets, the stiffness of your posture, and the cautious way people say good night. You dream of being called for roll call and forgetting your name. You dream of pews that stretch into infinity. You dream of blinking too loud. Your dreams dissolve at dawn, and you wake up with your stomach growling like it skipped ahead on the calendar. That's because it's Fast Day, the Puritan remix of misery with a side of sanctity. No breakfast, no lunch. Possibly a single humble whispering supper, if the Lord and the elders permit. It's not about cleansing the body. No one here cares about your metabolism. This is about atoning for community sins, most of which are probably yours. You groggily pull on the same drab clothes as yesterday. No frills. No buttons shaped like birds. Someone got in trouble for that once. You glance outside and spot others doing the same, preparing for a day of voluntary suffering enforced by peer pressure. You try to smile, but remember joy is under curfew. Fast days weren't just individual commitments. Entire towns would declare them in response to bad weather, poor harvests, illness, or even a suspicious number of sneezes. Sometimes the governor called for one. Other times the minister would stand in the pulpit and solemnly declare that God's wrath hath kindled against our pride and overcooked stews, and thus it was time to starve for spiritual reasons. Today's fast is in response to last month's failed communal fence project, which was interpreted not as poor planning, but as divine disapproval of someone's secret sin. Historians still debate whether this project truly failed due to religious offenses or just because no one brought nails. You head out stomach muttering like it's cursing in Latin. The village feels heavier today, quieter, like it's holding its breath or like it fainted from low blood sugar. The meeting house is already open. People file in slowly, heads bowed, eyes red from self-reflection or onions. It's a short service, just 2 sermons, a few psalms, and an announcement of who has offended the heavens recently. A teenager who skipped chores, a widow who wore a lavender ribbon, a blacksmith who sharpened his tools with too much gusto. There's no direct punishment, just naming and shaming. Sometimes that's worse. You cough once and several heads swivel in your direction. You're not even sure if coughing is a sin, but you hold your breath for 5 minutes just in case. After the service, no one heads home for a meal. Instead, they spread out across the fields and woods to pray in isolation. You're supposed to reflect, repent, and stay extremely hydrated if your water doesn't taste too decadent. You sit under a tree and try to think of all your moral failings. By lunch, your brain is empty, your stomach more so. You overhear someone nearby mumble, "I once thought about dancing." You write that one down in your mental list. That's definitely illegal. Now let's talk about dietary restrictions, because it turns out food laws weren't just about fasting. The Puritans believed certain foods encouraged laziness, vanity, or unnecessary comfort. Rich desserts too indulgent. Alcohol, borderline demonic unless consumed strictly for health or communion. Shellfish. Well, that's complicated. Historians still argue whether the aversion was theological, logistical, or just because someone once got food poisoning and blamed Beelzebub. One law from a small coastal village banned the import of spices not because they were foreign, but because they made food taste too worldly. Think about that cinnamon could send you down a sinful path. Imagine a snickerdoodle as the first step toward eternal damnation. Meanwhile, in your host's home, the pantry is a shrine to bleak sustenance, grains, salt, maybe a limp carrot. You swear one loaf of bread is judging you. You peek under a cloth to find a single dried apple slice and feel an irrational urge to apologize. Even how you eat mattered. No loud chewing, no overlong blessings, brevity is holy, and definitely no using utensils to stab playfully. That could be seen as irreverent. Table manners were serious business. In one record, a man was publicly corrected for wiping his mouth with flamboyance. Still not sure what that means, but you tuck a napkin under your chin with grave ceremony just in case. By mid-afternoon, you're lightheaded enough to start seeing angels or hallucinations shaped like bread rolls. You wander back toward town and notice a group of boys being chastised for imagining food too vividly. A sin of the mind, the elder mutters. They nod solemnly. One is definitely chewing air. You sit with them for a bit. No talking, just mutual hunger and the occasional stomach rumble that sounds dangerously joyful. Now here comes a fringe tidbit. There was at least one case recorded in which a man was excommunicated for making cake faces, mimicking the act of eating, or pretending to serve imaginary sweets to children on fast day. That man became a legend among local teenagers, but he spent 6 months under spiritual probation and had to stand during every church service without sitting as a form of penance. You wonder how many saints got their start with a cupcake craving and a defiant smirk. Evening falls and the town convenes for the communal silent meal. Not a feast, not a dinner, just a bite of something plain oats soaked in broth or thin corn gruel or stewed wind, as one local boy once called it. You take your bowl and sit cross-legged in the meeting house. No one speaks. They just chew slowly, looking at the floor like it might reveal their sins. There's a brief prayer. The minister says, "May this hunger remind us of his abundance." You nod like that makes sense, but mostly you just want a pretzel. Finally, the day ends with a candlelit confession walk. People go door to door, murmuring quiet apologies for small offenses. I stepped on your root cellar. I thought a prideful thought during the sermon. I imagined a turkey sandwich while kneeling. You make a half-hearted confession to your host. I smelled honey and didn't hate it. He nods sagely. It happens. You climb into bed that night still hungry but slightly holier, assuming you didn't dream about muffins. That would be at least a minor transgression. The bed creaks beneath you, and you whisper a final prayer. Forgive me for desiring jam. That's the thing about fast days. They weren't just about not eating. They were about making hunger feel righteous and turning everyday cravings into spiritual triumphs. You didn't just resist pie, you conquered sin. But historians still debate how sincerely people embraced these fasts. Were they acts of genuine humility, or were they performative rituals maintained out of fear, tradition, and the ever-watching eyes of your neighbors? Either way, your stomach has learned its place. Beneath the soul, beneath the sermon, beneath everything. Tomorrow, you're told there's a moral inspection. You don't know what that means, but you've already started regretting that time you blinked during prayer. The rooster doesn't crow so much as it scolds you awake. You open your eyes and already feel guilty, though you're not entirely sure why. Maybe it's because your first thought was, I hope there's breakfast today. Greedy, carnal, almost cheerful. You shake it off. Today is not for hunger, it's for introspection because it's moral inspection day. You drag yourself to the wash basin, splash water on your face, and prepare to be examined, not by a doctor, not even by a judge, but by your community, which has appointed itself the spiritual microscope of your life. You remember someone mentioning this yesterday, right before they chewed on a stick to keep from hallucinating a chicken leg. You didn't ask for more detail. That felt like fishing for trouble. Turns out, moral inspections are sort of like an audit, but instead of your taxes, it's your soul. Specific towns in 17th-century Puritan New England organized formal visitation days where elders or church-appointed committees would visit homes to evaluate the moral climate of each household. Clean floors, modest dress, properly subdued children, and the complete absence of anything resembling vanity or fun, that was the goal. You step outside and see neighbors already standing at stiff attention on their porches. A child sneezes. His mother murmurs a quick psalm and dusts his bonnet for good measure. Your host whispers, "Don't mention the whistling incident." You don't ask. Soon, two elders appear at the gate. They wear black, carry small ledgers and squint like they're trying to read your intentions through your forehead. You resist the urge to smile. It could be misinterpreted as flippant, or worse, French. They begin with a prayer which is long, grim, and includes the word temptation 6 times. Then they enter the home and start examining everything. The pantry is inspected for excess or indulgence. The children are asked basic catechism questions. You hold your breath when the youngest stares at them blankly before saying, "God is sometimes okay." A beat of silence. The elder nods slowly. Room for growth. You live another day. But it's not just your food or furniture. They ask about your behavior. Have you attended all church services? Have you spoken ill of authority? Have you at any time danced? The word lands in the room like a dropped hammer. You remember that dancing is so scandalous here, it has been legislated into oblivion. The very rhythm of your hips is viewed as a slippery slope toward eternal condemnation. One fringe example. In 1651, a Massachusetts man was fined for having moved his feet in a merry fashion at harvest. That's right, he wasn't at a party. He was just happy about turnips. Historians still argue whether he actually danced or simply shifted enthusiastically while hoeing. You're asked next, do you experience any spontaneous joy? You pause, only when it's raining. They nod. Rain is acceptable. Sunlight is suspicious. Next, they quiz your host about your daily habits. Do you read the Bible? Do you help with chores? Do you display any signs of vanity? You try to look humble. You consciously furrow your brow. It hurts a little. They inspect your boots. One elder lifts a skeptical eyebrow. Shined. You whisper, "I tripped into a puddle." He seems unconvinced. They eventually leave with polite nods promising to pray for your continued spiritual containment. You've passed for now. But the whole experience makes you look over your shoulder every time you scratch your head, just in case that's somehow indecent. Afterward, you ask what happens if someone fails a moral inspection. Your host answers solemnly, First a private warning, then a community meeting, then the stocks. You try not to react, because yes, even in 17th century Massachusetts, the infamous pillory and stocks were a favorite method of public correction. Commit a moral slip, and you could be locked into a wooden frame in the town square, your head and hands trapped to your shame broadcast to neighbors' livestock and passing geese. One man once ended up in the stocks for saying Sundays are boring, another for walking with undue swagger. You hear the birds chirp. Their tune is a little too jaunty. You frown at them just to be safe. Let's shift delicately to courtship regulations because nothing is immune from Puritan scrutiny. You'd think love would be beyond the reach of the magistrate, but here every whispered vow has a legal footnote. Courtship was monitored closely, with couples often required to sit up together in the girl's home under strict observation, sometimes with a literal wooden board placed between them. That's not metaphor, that's lumber. This practice called bundling was meant to allow a young man and woman to get to know each other in conversation while ensuring absolute chastity. A classic Puritan compromise you can court, but only with a physical barrier, both of you wrapped in separate blankets, fully clothed, and probably judged by the girl's grandmother seated 3 feet away, pretending to knit while eavesdropping like a hawk. One quirky tale passed around is of a boy who brought 2 boards to a bundling session in case one broke. He was hailed as a paragon of caution and also possibly a closet carpenter. Historians still debate whether bundling genuinely helped prevent impropriety or simply introduced the idea of measured temptation, the kind that made morality feel like a tightrope walk over hot cider. You try to imagine participating in such a ritual, but your modern brain keeps inserting Wi-Fi and Spotify and a privacy app. In Puritan reality, even the act of writing a love letter was suspicious. A little too poetic. That was vanity. Too affectionate, carnal. Too many adjectives, French again. After lunch, well-bred and broth, you accompany your host to observe a community arbitration, a sort of miniature court for minor moral and behavioral violations. Today's case. A woman accused of wearing sleeves too decorative to last week's meeting house gathering. Her crime, a lace cuff that fluttered in the wind like it had ambitions. She sits in the middle of a circle while elders question her choices. Did you stitch it yourself? Was it dyed? Do you feel proud? She answers softly, yes, yes, and no. After much prayer and 2 theological references, the court decides on leniency. She must remove the offending lace, donate it to the communal cloth fund, and write a reflective essay titled On the Temptation of Pretty Arms. Your host whispers, it could have been worse. Last week, a man was punished for smiling at his reflection in the well. As the sun sets, you reflect on how external morality has become an internal compass here. It's not just about following rules. It's about learning to regulate every impulse, every glance, every accidental joy. You realize now why everyone walks slowly and talks in hushed tones. They aren't sad, they're just vigilant. Even dreams aren't exempt. One man confessed to sinful fantasies involving roast beef and had to fast for 3 extra days. Another claimed he dreamed he could fly and was told to pray for humility. You lie down that night in the small wooden bed, surrounded by creaking beams and the faint sound of your neighbor reading Leviticus aloud through the wall. You think about your inspection, your almost polished boots, your accidental smirk. Tomorrow promises a change of pace, a town-wide behavioral drill designed to promote community unity and weed out hidden moral decay. You're not sure what that means yet, but you're already planning to blink less and frown more, just in case. Dawn filters in like judgment through the window slats. You roll over, already sensing that today carries an unusual weight. Your host greets you at the doorway with a solemn nod and says, "It's drill day." You blink momentarily, unsure if you've enlisted in a militia or joined some kind of theological boot camp. Turns out you're not far off. Today is the behavioral drill, a curious Puritan invention where the town simulates moral threats to test everyone's reflexes. Think of it like a fire drill, but instead of escaping flames, you're trying to outrun sin, or at least the suggestion of it. You step outside and see neighbors already assembling in rows in the commons, faces flat as pond ice. Children fidget until silenced by sharp looks. No one knows quite what today's scenario will be. That's the point. Temptation must come unannounced. The elder in charge, Brother Zebediah, who looks like his diet consists solely of dry oats, and divine disapproval raises his staff. Today we address the threat of idleness, he announces. A few audible gasps. Someone drops their butter churn. Idleness in Puritan New England is no mere laziness. It's a gateway vice, the root of disobedience, sexual temptation, and even witchcraft. A person not working is a person imagining dance moves, or plotting muffins, or gazing wistfully at clouds. And so begins the Community Industriousness Challenge. Each household must complete a set of assigned tasks before the bell tolls, hauling wood-shelling beans, cleaning stables, churning butter again, but this time morally. But here's the twist inspectors wander through to catch anyone slouching, sighing, or pausing too long between chores. Your job sorting lentils, by color, by hand. You sit in the dust with a large bowl and immediately panic. What if I sort too efficiently and seem prideful? But if I go too slowly, I'm idle. You settle for an even soulfully remorseful pace and make sure to furrow your brow every few minutes to look introspective. An inspector passes. You pretend to mutter a psalm. They nod and move on. Nearby, a teenager is caught tapping her foot while washing a bucket. She claims it was involuntary. A warning is issued anyway. This entire drill isn't about productivity. It's about distraction-proof piety. Can you work while being watched, while praying internally, while resisting joy, and while suppressing your very human need to say, Historians still debate whether these drills had measurable results or simply served as psychological theater. Some suggest they were performative, a method of instilling conformity through spectacle. Others argue they helped communities spot early signs of deviance before they became full-blown spiritual emergencies. You know, like laughter. After lunch, gruel on gruel, you're taken to observe the second half of the drill temptation simulation. This part is wild. Designated townsfolk, often young men trying to earn back trust dress slightly too colorfully, carry props like playing cards or ribbon and pretend to be agents of corruption. They walk through the streets offering fake sins. It's like Renaissance cosplay meets theological improv. One man dramatically offers someone a gold coin and says, "Wouldst thou abandon the Sabbath for this?" Another stage whispers, "I know a woman who sings outside of prescribed hours." The townspeople must visibly reject these lures. No mild nods, no quiet, no thank yous. It must be a full, emphatic rejection, usually including a Bible verse, and if possible, a symbolic gesture like casting dust over your own head. You watch a child solemnly denounce a doll because its dress has trim. The crowd applauds. The doll is burned. You try not to stare. You're approached next. A corrupter holds up a crude drawing of a fiddle and says, "Music in the barn. This Friday." Your mouth goes dry. Music, you say, slowly leads to rhythm, and rhythm leads to error. A woman nearby sighs contentedly. You've passed. But then you hear a low gasp. Someone has accepted a second helping of cider, cold cider, without prior prayer. Everyone freezes. The accused stammers, "It was warm earlier. I simply chilled it." A murmur runs through the crowd. Chilled cider without consent of the council. That's nearly hedonistic. He is given a symbolic twine band to wear for the rest of the week, a mark of potential waywardness. As the drill winds down, you see people look exhausted, but also slightly relieved. Everyone has performed righteousness, or at least pantomimed it with enough sincerity to pass inspection. Back at the house, your host pours you a cup of room-temperature water with a reverent nod. "You did well today," he says, "especially the lentils." You raise your cup like a toast, but only a little too much enthusiasm might seem Roman Catholic. Later, you're invited to join the elders for a reading of the town covenant. This is no casual club charter. It's a multi-page sanctified agreement every adult must sign and recite at least once per year, affirming allegiance to the colony's moral order. You sit cross-legged on the cold meeting house floor, listening as a deacon with a voice like gravel recites line after line of sacred behavioral promises. We shall walk blamelessly before one another. We shall not borrow vanity from distant lands. We shall rebuke sin where we find it, even if it dwells within ourselves. One clause reads, "We shall not permit skirts above the ankle nor facial hair of alarming exuberance." Your host whispers that was added after Brother Elias's beard incident. You decide not to ask. But what strikes you most is how the covenant doesn't just prohibit sin, it defines identity. To be Puritan isn't just to worship a certain way, it's to inhabit a complete moral framework where even silence has a flavor, and every gesture, sneeze, giggle, or twitch can be measured on a spiritual scale. Even pet ownership comes with guidelines. Dogs are permitted if they are muted in voice and untempted by frolic. Cats are tolerated for their mouse hunting, but only if they don't nap in sunbeams too luxuriously. One record details a goat being expelled from a household for excessive frisking. Historians still argue whether the goat was truly unruly or simply misunderstood in his theological alignment. As dusk falls, you join the rest of the town for reflection hour held in near darkness. People gather in small circles to discuss inner battles, moments during the drill when their thoughts wandered or their resolve trembled. A young woman admits she enjoyed the way her apron swayed when she walked. A man confesses that he imagined bread crusts shaped like animals. One child says she wanted to skip instead of walk and is gently but firmly reassigned psalm memorization duties. You nod along, though inside your mind you're thinking about cider. Cold, tart, morally ambiguous cider. Finally, you're ushered back to the house where you write a brief personal reflection as required. Today, I resisted falsity and vanity. I sorted lentils. I turned away from symbolic sin. I felt temptation brush my shoulder and chose the dust instead. Your host peeks over your shoulder and gives a soft grunt of approval. You lie down, blanket scratchy but righteous, and fall asleep to the low chant of your neighbor reciting proverbs in her barn. Tomorrow, you're told, begins the Penance Week warm-up. You're not sure what that entails. Probably more lentils, possibly fewer smiles. But you survived drill day without ending up in stocks. That's a win. The air feels heavier this morning, like it's been filtered through a sieve made of ash and unspoken regrets. You wake to the sound of distant sobbing, controlled, reverent sobbing, and your host tells you with a tone as flat as old bread, it's warm-up day. You sit up cautiously. Warm up for what? He adjusts his cap solemnly. Penance Week. Today we prepare to remember everything we've ever done wrong, even hypothetically. You let that sink in. So today is rehearsal for regret. You're handed a slim booklet with the deeply uncheerful title, Ladder of Contrition. It contains 42 possible sins ranked from momentary spiritual slackness to crimes of the flesh. You're told to read them, slowly reflect, then rank yourself. This is not a private exercise. Your answers will be discussed gently, but publicly. As you sip your broth, it's always broth. Your host leans in and mutters, everyone always pretends to be guilty of item number 17, makes you look just flawed enough. You turn the page. Item number 17, harbored unvoiced irritation at a sibling. You nod. Safe bet. The day begins with the ritual of silent processing. You and the townsfolk walk slowly in a circle around the meeting house, each person holding a small, smooth stone. You're supposed to assign your worst unspoken sin to the stone, then return it to the community hearth as a symbolic cleansing. You hold your stone and try to think of a safe but mildly interesting guilt. The time you smiled at a squirrel. The moment you imagined having jam. That dream where you own 2 pillows. Eventually, you whisper to your rock, I once hoped for butter, and drop it onto the pile. Your host glances over and murmurs bold. As midday arrives, so does the public murmur hour. This is when everyone gathers in groups of 3 or 4 and shares minor misdeeds from the past season. Not full confessions, just teaser sins. Little appetites for darkness. It's like spiritual appetizers before the full-course confession to come. A woman admits she stared too long at a weather vane. A man confesses he lingered in bed after sunrise. One child says she mentally named a cow, then weeps. But here's the kicker. All these mini-confessions are carefully moderated by the town's contrition monitors, individuals chosen for their tone, expressionless faces, and sheer ability to nod meaningfully at absolutely everything. You make a small joke about craving stew and receive a soft frown and a whisper. Acknowledge it, but don't dwell. Later, the community proceeds to the Echo Psalm, a structured recitation where one voice reads a verse of guilt or repentance, and the crowd repeats it back. The cadence is hypnotic, each echo slightly softer, as if you're all sinking together into a warm pool of shared shame. We are dust, says the reader. We are dust, echoes the crowd. We hope to taste honey. We hope to taste honey. We thought our thoughts too loud. We thought our thoughts too loud. It goes on for 40 verses. By the end, even the goats seem humbled. One of today's more peculiar rituals is the garb of reflection. Everyone wears a drab gray smock, no color, no buttons, just sackcloth, fastened by a rope. It's like you're all trying to cosplay as remorse. The outfits itch. That's the point. You're instructed to wear your smock while performing tasks of silent endurance. Today, that means helping shovel manure behind the meeting house in absolute silence, all while imagining your worst impulses being expelled with each toss. You whisper to yourself, "May this represent my vanity," and lob a particularly odorous pile into the ditch. Later, you find out that someone once smiled during this chore and was assigned a 3-day barefoot walk on stones as corrective empathy. Historians still argue whether he was smiling at the manure or at his own inner joke. Either way, the stones were sharp. The afternoon brings a reflective exercise known as the if table, a long wooden board set with parchment and questions like, if you had never known the Sabbath, what would you have become? And if God asked you to remove your own comfort, what would you sacrifice first? You write answers like, a third of my blanket and spoons. It's not clear if these are spiritually deep or laughably shallow, but your neighbor nods approvingly, so you assume you've passed the vibe check. But it's not all personal confession. The Puritans had a flair for communal responsibility, too. Warm-up day includes the whispers of witness, a time when townspeople mention things they've observed in others, not as accusations, but as suggestions for self-reflection. Someone stands and gently offers, "I once saw Sister Eliza linger by the dye jars." Eliza nods, tears forming. It is true. Another person says Brother Thomas hummed during fence mending. Gasps. A man in the back collapses dramatically, possibly unrelated, but symbolic nonetheless. And here's the twist. You're not allowed to deny the whispers. You can clarify, but you must accept that perception matters. Even if you weren't sinning, you looked like you might be. You start wondering if the breeze is judging you. As evening descends, so does the tone quieter, now more meditative. The townspeople gather by lantern light for what's called the Morning of Joys. In this haunting little ceremony, everyone takes a moment to name something they once enjoyed that they've now released. It's part elegy, part group therapy. A young woman whispers riddles, a man mumbles fancy soap, someone says the way wheat sways. You hesitate, then admit, "Once I drew a cat in the dirt." Your host pats your shoulder. "I used to whistle," he says. "Still do sometimes, in my dreams." You glance around. No one reacts. For the first time all day, there's no frowning, no muttering of psalms, just stillness. Historians still argue whether this ritual was truly effective at purging internal joy or if it simply taught people to hide it better. Some claim the Morning of Joys marked the beginning of performative melancholy grief as a sign of virtue. The final event of Warm-Up Day is the candle of contrast. Each household lights a single taper and places it in a pitch-dark room. Everyone sits in silence and watches the light flicker. The idea is to meditate on one's spiritual shadow in the presence of barely illuminated truth. You're not entirely sure what you're seeing. Your knees the wall, a symbolic reckoning with mortality. But the stillness is potent. You feel, for just a moment, the pulse of everyone's breath moving in time. Outside, the night wraps itself around the town like a heavy quilt. The elders extinguish the torches one by one. All you hear is the crunch of sandals on gravel and the gentle creak of a shutter swaying in the wind. You return to your lodging, your smock smelling faintly of hay and apology. Your host is already in bed, whispering something to the ceiling. You climb under your single blanket and think about the bread you didn't crave, the laughter you didn't let rise, the happiness you didn't claim. Tomorrow begins actual penance week, where all of today's warm-up exercises are replaced by the real thing. Full confessions, public weeping, repentance, fasts, and spiritual reenactments of theoretical guilt. But for now, you feel strangely light, emptied out. Maybe that's the point. Maybe guilt has a kind of rhythm, too. You awaken to absolute silence so complete that even the birds seem to have taken a vow. This, your host whispers, is the official beginning of Penance Week 5, full days of structured spiritual mortification, moral accounting, and the occasional symbolic foot washing. It's not a time for talking, joking, or even chewing loudly. It's time for your soul to be steam-cleaned by structured shame. You're handed a folded square of rough wool. It's a shroud of humility worn like a scarf over the smock from yesterday. It doesn't match, and that's deliberate. Vanity is the gateway drug to all other sins after all. Even color coordination might tip you into perdition. Your first stop, the naming tent. Constructed each year from plain wood and canvas, the naming tent sits at the edge of the town commons like some kind of holy DMV. Inside, every adult must step forward, face the panel of 3 elders, and state the sin for which they are most structurally vulnerable. This is not confession. This is forecasted confession. You're not revealing a past sin, but predicting your most likely spiritual downfall. You step forward. The elder in the center peers over the top of his book and asks, "What tempts your soul?" You almost say biscuits, but reconsider. Eventually, you murmur, "Daydreaming," about naps. He nods. You will carry the feather token. A small gray feather is pressed into your palm, representing wayward thought. Others carry tokens of broken twine, symbolizing fraying obedience, or pebbles' heaviness of appetite. One man is given a splinter. No one asks what it means. From the naming tent, you're directed to the stations of reconciliation, a slow pilgrimage through town, where participants must perform symbolic rituals at different sin markers. It's like an obstacle course designed by a poet with anxiety. Station 1, the Well of Vanity. You must draw water without looking at your reflection. You stare awkwardly into the distance as you lower the bucket, resisting the urge to sneak a peek at your own face. Not because you love your face, but because now you're told not to. It's a trap. Station 2, the Cradle of Envy. Here everyone kneels beside an empty cradle and imagines the life of someone more favored. You're asked to murmur aloud the name of the person and what they have that you covet. This gets real awkward real fast. One woman mutters Rachel and her shoes. Another says Brother Amos and his land near the stream. You whisper the tanner's boy. He naps in shade. Nobody judges you. Everyone envies someone. Station 3, the Table of Idle Hands. You're asked to sit for 10 minutes without doing anything. No humming, no shifting, no prayers. Just stillness. It's pure agony. The internal monologue alone is incriminating. You spend half the time trying not to think of bread, and the other half panicking that you're too comfortable being idle. A bell rings onward. The 4th station is the Scourge Path. Don't worry, no actual lashes, just symbolic flagellation. Participants walk a winding path while reciting personal mantras of repentance. Along the way, they flick themselves with pine branches dipped in cold water. It's itchy damp and makes you sneeze at least once. You pass someone whispering, "I renounce excessive stew," another chants, "Forgive my humming Lord." You go with, "I have smiled at clouds and it was too much." Halfway through, it starts to rain. No one breaks pace. The elders later say it was a sign of cooperative nature. You suspect it was just weather. By evening, your wool shroud smells like wet moss and guilt. You're instructed to dry it by the hearth, in silence, while copying passages from the Journal of Susanna Greaves, a legendary penitent woman who allegedly lived in a self-dug pit for 2 winters to contemplate her own pride. Historians still argue whether she actually existed or was an allegorical invention to shame teenagers out of sass. Regardless, her journal contains passages like, "Today, I stared at a bird too long. It did not sing, and I deserved that. And I thought a thought and burned it down with prayer." You write your copy slowly, resisting the temptation to doodle a frog in the margin. The next morning begins with group lamentation. Held at the meeting house, this service is less about preaching and more about collective grieving. Everyone takes turns stepping forward and naming one thing they regret. Then the entire congregation moans a low, slow, harmonized "mmm" like a cow in theological distress. A boy says he broke a comb. "Mmm." A woman says she felt joy on a Tuesday. "Mmm." You confess to once naming a spider and wishing it well. A pause. Then mmm. After lamentation, there's a brief noon of mutual silence, a midday break, where townsfolk gather in close quarters but must not speak, look at each other, or move too suddenly. It's like a spiritual silent disco, minus music joy or movement. Someone coughs. Everyone flinches. Then comes the procession of the ashes. Each household brings a small bundle of past vanities, dried herbs for scented soap, colorful yarn, or pieces of whimsical crockery, and adds it to the communal fire. The air smells like regret and lilac. You add a tiny carved whistle you found in the woods. You hadn't used it, but you thought about it. As the flames rise, a speaker reminds everyone, Even unindulged joy is joy, and joy must be weighed. You don't know whether to feel offended or honored. By now, you're beginning to notice something. Everyone looks slightly relieved. Penance Week, though, heavy offers structure. It turns nebulous guilt into action. You mess up, but then you do something about it. You fast. You write. You say you're sorry. You burn your dream of having a third pillow. There's even a fringe group within the community, unofficial of course, who get really into it. They make extra confession lists, write personal litanies, and invent new types of remorse like accidental smugness or unintended tone. One woman tells you she created a sin map, a hand-drawn chart of her barn, where she tracked the spiritual consequences of each corner. Northwest corner, she says, where I once sighed without proper cause. You nod, impressed, concerned, yes. On day 4, the town engages in vocal contrition, a dramatic ritual where pairs of people are randomly selected to take turns reenacting past conversations but corrected for holiness. You're paired with a farmer who once asked his wife, "Is it soup again?" with detectable sarcasm. You play his wife. He says, "Is it soup again?" You respond, "Soup is the Lord's boiling wisdom, and I rejoice in repetition." Everyone claps gently. You switch roles. You say, "Did you feed the chickens?" He answers yes, but not their worldly hunger, their spiritual appetite for discipline. It's kind of weirdly fun. But don't smile. That's not in the script. As the sun sets on day 4, you're given a final task: compose a psalm of personal apology. You sit alone by the creek, writing in your best plain script. I once desired leisure, and it trembled my bones. I saw my shadow on the floor and mistook it for purpose. Forgive me, firm-footed Lord, who needs no blankets. You read it aloud once softly. A frog croaks unimpressed. That feels correct. The final day of Penance Week is Atonement Sabbath. The entire town dresses in white, simple, clean robes and walks barefoot in silence to the high meadow. There, under the open sky, a single elder reads aloud from a scroll of collective sins of the year. Most are things you've already heard: envy, sloth, idle chatter, misaligned joy. But a few are new too. Unlicensed fiddle strings were found in a hayloft. One pig was fed with affectionate tone, and a shadow puppet was attempted. When the list ends, the town stands still for 1 full hour, not in prayer, not in thought, just being. Then the bell tolls, once, and Penance Week is over. People embrace modestly, no hugging, just hand on shoulder, brief and breathless. You're handed a small sprig of thyme, a symbol of renewed discipline. As you walk back down the hill barefoot, your host smiles just slightly. You did well, he says. And this time you believe it. Sleepy-eyed and soul-scrubbed, you might think the hardest part is behind you. But no, welcome to the Civic Enforcement Fortnight, a 2-week period where the entire town becomes both the watched and the watchers. Imagine your neighborhood transformed into a quiet, intensely polite version of a surveillance state, where no infraction is too small, no glance too suggestive, and absolutely no pie crust can be flakier than regulation allows. You rise early to a fog-drenched morning. From somewhere down the lane, a bell rings a single note, the same note repeated every minute for the next hour, the tone of accountability, meant to keep people focused. Mostly, it just gives you tinnitus. Your host hands you a folded paper. It's your volunteer rotation. Every adult is expected to take on at least one enforcement duty during the fortnight. You scan the list. Fence line inspection, North Commons. Street demeanor recorder, Main Road. Sabbath pacing, overseer, garden paths. Griddle compliance officer, kitchen checks. You're assigned the thrilling job of tone auditor, where you must wander the village and quietly listen for deviations in voice too loud, too cheerful, or heaven forbid musical. You're given a small slate and some chalk. Just mark the house your trainer explains if it seemed vibrationally suspect. You spend the day leaning against fences and pretending to study pebbles while listening intently. A boy sneezes and says, "Well, that was fun." You clutch your chalk dramatically. One woman is caught humming while hanging laundry. She insists it was a thread count prayer, but your mentor shakes her head. Too melodic. Meanwhile, public decency stewards patrol with long sticks, not for poking people, but for measuring. A child is scolded for standing with 1 foot more than 18 inches apart. It gives the appearance of frivolity. 2 teens are spotted throwing pebbles at a tree, and immediately a panel convenes to assess whether this counts as proto-dancing. Spoiler, it does. You eat lunch quietly under the watchful eye of the crumb custodian who silently monitors the table after each meal to ensure that no crumbs are left behind, as waste implies indulgence. She uses a brush and tiny mirror. Her intensity is inspiring, also terrifying. But it's not just rules for others. Everyone must report on themselves too. Each evening, townsfolk return to their homes and fill out a moral inventory log, a little parchment booklet with entries like, "Did I show unwarranted joy? Did I speak before someone finished speaking? Did I use a noun with frills, e.g., darling or giggle? Did I sense a rhythm?" You check yes on almost smiled at a goose and walked with too much bounce. Then you must seal it in wax and drop it anonymously into the sin box, which sits in the center of the square beneath a discreetly judgmental statue of a man squinting at a loaf of bread. Midway through the fortnight, accountability banners appear across the village. Large linen sheets with painted phrases like, "Stillness is strength," "Unwatched hands drift." Clarity comes in monotone. The nose knows that one still unsettles you. These banners are changed out daily by the slogan committee, who hold passionate debates over which phrases are doctrinally safe. Historians still argue whether this tradition was rooted in early Protestant sermon culture or a particularly intense quilting club coup of 1654. Alongside the banners, there's a tradition known as the Hour of Subdued Expression. Every afternoon at exactly 2 o'clock, the entire town engages in muted dramatics, miming feelings without smiling, frowning, or gesturing too broadly. It's like watching a mime troupe with social anxiety. You participate, you pretend to be cold, then hungry, then deeply moved by a sunset you're not allowed to describe. It's exhausting. Still, some townsfolk treat this fortnight like a sacred festival. They wear special neutral-toned accessories like beige ribbons or brown thimbles, quietly competitive in their moral austerity. One man boasts that he has not used a metaphor in 6 days. Another woman has gone even further. She has adopted single-syllable speech as a personal challenge. You pass her near the well. "Nice day," you say. "Sun good," she replies. You nod. She nods. You are both victorious. Then there are the shame plaques. Wooden signs, plain and simple, hung discreetly on doors of homes where mild infractions have occurred. Not punishments, just reminders. They read things like excess chatter, socks with pattern, overheated porridge, lawn glee. They're removed after 3 days, or sooner if the household writes a convincing poem of apology and recites it at the town center. Your host shows you the drawer where he keeps old poems. "I've been guilty of bark enthusiasm," he admits with a sigh. Twice. You feel honored. On day 11, there's a break in the strict rhythm, the solemn picnic. Yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. People sitting on blankets outdoors, eating unseasoned lentils from shared bowls in silence. Children are allowed to speak, but only in questions. Is this lentil hot? Can trees sin? Did the goat look at me funny? Adults, of course, can only answer with nods or scripture fragments. It's bizarre, it's peaceful, it's oddly grounding. You realize the entire village has crafted this psychological habitat where guilt, correction, and community intersect like a very well-organized anxiety dream. As the end of Civic Enforcement Fortnight approaches, everyone gathers for the Night of Accumulated Correction, a kind of open mic for confessions of enforcement gone wrong. One man admits he scolded a dog for yawning. Another woman cries because she accused a child of joy when the child was merely dizzy. You confess to mislabeling someone's cough as a chuckle. Everyone nods. Then the elder steps forward and reads aloud the final phrase of the fortnight. We were not flawless, but we were aware. And, just like that, the tones shift. The slate is wiped literally. Everyone takes turns washing the chalkboards used for tracking infractions. Children scrub extra hard to atone for any squirrel-related glee. You help your host rinse out the ink from his moral inventory log. It's oddly satisfying. As the sun sets on the last day, a town-wide exhale seems to ripple across the commons. People stretch slowly. They walk with a bit more swing in their step. Someone even almost waves. You retreat to your lodging with your journal, now packed with phrases like "socks must not provoke." You feel a quiet pride. For 2 weeks, you became part of something so controlled, so peculiar, so wonderfully ridiculous in its seriousness that it might have broken your brain just enough to reset it. Tomorrow, the banners will be taken down. The shame plaques will go into storage. The goose will reclaim its dignity. And you'll wake up watched less. You awaken to a silence that isn't silence, it's the vacuum left behind after an entire village stops eavesdropping on itself. The civic enforcement fortnight has ended, and with it, the eyes on the back of your neck have vanished. You stretch. Nothing creaks except your knees, and the floorboards, and your pride. But don't relax too much, because as one wave of anxiety recedes, another creeps in public punishment day. Yes, you heard that right. Not the cinematic Dungeon and Dragon stuff your imagination might offer up, but something far stranger, and slower, and bureaucratically painful. Welcome to the age of constructive shame. You trudge outside, blinking into the light, and find that the town has already gathered, neatly, silently, in a wide grassy square surrounded by modest wooden buildings. A platform no higher than a toddler's reach sits in the center. It's not even painted, just resigned looking. The first punishment today is for a man who overwatered his cabbage patch. He steps onto the platform bows slightly and reads a poem. Too wet the leaves did shudder, too soaked the roots took flight. Forgive my hand's soft blunder, I mourn their soggy plight. A few villagers snap their fingers in appreciation. Another bangs a wooden spoon softly against her palm, a sign of support. He steps down. That's it. His shame has been gently expressed. What follows is a long procession of petty creative and exquisitely specific punishments. A young woman who was caught smiling at a cloud is asked to wear gray spectacles for one full day to mute her view of the world. They're not even prescription, just foggy. A baker who used a cinnamon stick on an unsanctioned weekday has to bake flavorless rolls for the entire congregation with a sash that reads, "Spice is not always nice." There is, of course, the infamous pillory of perspective, but don't imagine shackles and stocks. No, this is Puritan New England with a theatrical flair. The pillory is an oversized wooden viewing box placed at the center of the square. The transgressor sits inside facing a single tiny hole that looks at a bland wooden plank. For 1 hour, they are required to journal their thoughts about humility, repetition, and plank-related virtues. You peek inside when no one's looking. There's already a quote carved into the interior wall. It is not the plank that changes, it is you. Modern psychologists might be impressed or deeply concerned. Then there's the sock-shaming fence, a literal line of drying pegs where violators must hang their incorrect hosiery for public display. This morning's lineup includes one pair with a paisley swirl too secular, a crimson stocking too festive, a pair with mismatched elastic tension suggests wildness. You'd laugh, but everyone around you is nodding solemnly. Meanwhile, a local child is given the role of punishment announcer, not because of clarity or voice, but because her reading pace is so slow, it's considered a form of penance in itself. She reads from a scroll that might as well be written on molasses. Mistress Hannah did whilst buttering. The silence is palpable. Everyone suffers, that's the point. And what about those famous wooden letters you've seen in Puritan paintings? Yes, they're here. The lettering ritual is alive and well, but not quite how you'd expect. Instead of a giant red A, townsfolk wear temporary letters sewn into sashes or attached to their caps, and the meanings delightfully unhelpful. F is out frivolous. N, yours noticed in church. H, tar, hummed without clearance. E, yours yearned visibly. There's even a debated Z used rarely and only when a person has been caught sleeping with zest. Not sleeping with someone with zest, that's different. Historians still argue whether these symbolic markings were truly moral rebukes or more like psychological memes, simplified shorthand for reinforcing community expectations. One scholar famously called them embroidered emojis of guilt. The accused wear their letters for exactly 1 day, and some lean into the absurdity. One man has bedazzled his F. He is quietly rebuked for it. After the letter procession, it's time for the repentance tableau. Picture this: small groups perform silent scenes of regret, acted out slowly and without props. Today's vignettes include a man returning a spoon to a table over and over, a woman washing the same cup with increasing care, two friends exchanging shoes, then switching back in melancholy rhythm. A small group of elders observes each performance, murmuring approval or frowning with exquisite restraint. You wonder, is this punishment or performance art with a Calvinist twist? Then comes something utterly baffling: the apology fruit tree. It's a real tree gnarled, mid-sized, and completely bare planted near the meeting house. Whenever someone commits a minor offense, they're instructed to tie a string with a wooden fruit-shaped charm to the tree's limbs. Each fruit represents a different error. Apple, impatience. Pear, sarcasm. Fig, enthusiasm without justification. Pomegranate, issues too layered to discuss here. You watch as one elderly man ties a particularly large, gourd-shaped charm to the lowest branch. Someone whispers, "It's the seasonal blend." Poor fellow. At the end of each season, the charms are removed and burned in a formal Ash of Atonement ceremony. And yes, there's a song. It goes, "Smoke of my failing, breeze of my bend, carry my slipping to merciful end." It's basically a dirge with a beat you could never dance to, even if you tried, which you won't, because dancing's still under review. Oh, and speaking of reviews, welcome to the public suggestion basket. Every citizen may drop in an anonymous slip recommending a new punishment or tweaking an old one. This week's top suggestions: replace Gruel Day with Broth Day to promote emotional dilution. Add a required grump hour each week so no one tries to fake cheer. Introduce a new letter B for browsing, purpose unclear. Not all suggestions make it into practice. Some are debated for years. The proposal for a sighing tax has been tabled since 1678. Now you're probably wondering, is any of this effective? Well, the town does seem to function quietly, predictably. People know their roles. And there's a strange comfort in structured self-policing, like an emotional IKEA manual, but every piece leads to guilt. Still, not everyone buys into the system. One old widow who's seen more letter ceremonies than she can count whispers to you during the midday hush. They use performance to flatten the soul. Smile too much and you're punished. Don't smile at all and you're watched harder. Then she shrugs and takes another bite of her repentance biscuit dry, unsweetened the size of a coin. You're left to chew on that figuratively and literally. By the end of the day, the last ceremony begins washing of the stage. Villagers scrub the punishment platform with lavender water and bundles of pine needles, not for hygiene but to signal closure. A group hums a single note, no harmony allowed. Children sprinkle gray sand in a circle, a visual reminder that shame need not stain. It's beautiful in a way. If you're into emotionally repressed modernist symbolism, you wander home half expecting to be stopped for walking too wistfully, but no one does. Tomorrow things go back to normal, just judgmental neighbors' long sermons, and more grain than your stomach can politely decline. And yet somewhere deep inside you feel something shift. Not quite peace, but maybe a kind of emotional exfoliation. You've been seen, you've been corrected, and now you're free. Well, until next time someone hums, you wake to birdsong. Real birds this time, not the sanctioned low-chirp chastity robins from Enforcement Week. Just regular, unruly, joyful birds chirping with the kind of unregulated happiness that would get them censured if they wore breeches. Today, you're headed to one of the most curious zones in Puritan New England. No stocks, no sermons, no shame letters. Well, fewer shame letters, the marketplace. Yes, even in Puritan society, commerce had to exist, though calling it a marketplace feels a bit generous. It's less grand bazaar, more bleak shed collective. You arrive to find what appears to be a somber lineup of wooden stalls, each merchant standing with the posture of someone trying not to be excited about their own produce. Overhead hangs a linen banner bleached white with severe lettering, "Fair trade, fair mind, fair God." It's all very anti-sparkle. You begin at the grain stall, where a man with hands like dry bark offers wheat, barley, and oats with permission slips. Each grain has an accompanying scripture tag so you can feel appropriately pious while making porridge. One tag reads, "Barley, for the humble stew, not the boastful loaf." You nod as if that means something. A few steps away, a woman sells root vegetables, but only the ones considered morally appropriate. No flamboyant eggplants here. Carrots are allowed, but must not be arranged provocatively. You hear her scold a customer, "Turn that beet the other way, no need to flirt with your tubers." Still, there's an art to buying here. Puritans had rules not just for what you could buy, but how you were supposed to do it. Bartering is preferred over coinage, but not too zealously, lest it seem you enjoy the deal-making. You may compliment someone's goods, but only in biblical phrasing. "These parsnips are anointed with favor" is acceptable. "Wow, that's a juicy squash, will land you on a list." Haggling is technically allowed, but no smiles are to be exchanged during negotiation. Smiling, oh, greed in disguise. Historians still argue whether this marketplace etiquette derived from pure Calvinist rigor or from a deep culturally embedded fear of anything vaguely resembling a carnival. Then there's the color policy. All goods must be packaged, bagged, or wrapped in subdued tones. No crimson string, no patterned burlap. You spot one rebellious bundle tied with pale yellow thread and catch the vendor mouthing, "Forgive me," as she sells it. There are even guilds, loose, unjoyful associations of like tradespeople who keep track of each other's tones and textures. You're drawn to the button man, a wiry fellow who peddles handmade fasteners all round and brown, never shiny. He tells you solemnly that there was once a lustrous toggle scandal that nearly divided the town. You try to picture this. You fail. As you move on, you notice a special booth set apart by a hedge of small wooden stakes. This is the approved bookstall, where literature has been vetted, blessed, and in some cases partially redacted. Titles include A Consideration of Modesty in Grain Sorting, The Sin of Sudden Movements, an Analysis, Calvin's Lesser Letters for Thoughtful Children, 1,000 Acceptable Names for a Gray Cat. You pick up a copy of The Brevity of Merriment, a Warning, but are informed it requires elder approval before reading. You put it back, respectfully. Nearby children huddle near the rag bin exchange. Here, families trade strips of old cloth for other strips of old cloth. No one explains why. No one questions it. It's the original slow fashion, just very, very slow. But not all is monotone. You discover a semi-secret area in the corner behind a willow fence, the seasonal table. Once a quarter, the community is allowed one small display of permitted festivity. Today's theme, rust-toned gratitude. The table features a loaf shaped like a turkey but not too turkey-shaped, a gourd painted with a psalm number, 3 acorns dressed in miniature cloaks to symbolize reverent preparedness. You're moved, slightly. In hushed tones, a woman nearby tells you about the blackberry incident of '57 when a child arranged berries into a smiley face. It was declared a patterned joy transgression. A formal letter of correction was sent to the child's goat. Yes, the goat, because ownership implies responsibility. Oh, and yes, livestock are also part of this scene. A man walks past with 2 chickens in a sack labeled "Praise Not Pet." The implication is clear affection toward animals should be careful and ideally theological. A goat stands near a salt block shaped like a Bible. It licks slowly, reverently. Meanwhile, town criers wander the aisles, but instead of hawking sales, they shout corrections. Things like, "Thou shalt not linger by the fruit with envious eyes." No crinkling of bags beyond the 6th minute. The sweet corn has been weighed and found acceptable. Sometimes they issue regret notices, slips of parchment declaring small errors in earlier trades. One merchant quietly shows you his collection. Sold a potato too swiftly. Displayed oats with unseemly arrangement. Gave discount with visible fondness. You ask if he ever disputes a notice. He blinks twice, then whispers no one disputes the parchment. As the market winds down, you witness something peculiar, the bartering circle of quiet regret. Participants sit in a ring goods before them and pass items slowly to the right. No words, no eye contact. When something reaches you that you don't want, you simply place it gently behind you in a small pile, labeled reflection. The whole thing feels like speed dating meets Quaker silence, but with radishes. Suddenly the sound of a harp, just 2 notes is heard. It's the closing tone. Market is over. All goods must be wrapped in dust cloths. Any unsold items are to be rested in barrels lined with linen and twigs. The tone rings again, slightly higher this time, and you watch as people bow slightly before packing their stalls. Then comes your favorite part, the complaint circle. After every market, the townsfolk gather under the observation tree and list their grievances not about others, but about themselves. The goal, to clear the trade spirit. One woman mutters, "I did admire the celery too openly." A man weeps gently as he confesses, "I overdescribed my turnips. I called them hearty." Someone behind you sighs and says, "I felt pride near the honey." He is immediately comforted. No coins change hands here, only personal reckonings. You're offered a slate and a piece of chalk. You write, "Stared too long at the goats, smiled at a beat, pondered laughter." It feels good. As you walk back through the now empty market, your shoes crunch over the straw-strewn ground. The stalls look like ghosts of commerce draped in their soft-colored cloths. You pass the approval book stall again, where the clerk offers you a parchment bookmark with the phrase, "Spend not with zest, but with consideration." You take it. You tuck it into your coat pocket. And as you round the corner, you hear one last thing, the quiet laughter of children running through a field with their arms out. Two elders start to rise to intervene, but another gently places a hand on their shoulder. "Let them be," he says. It's post-market hour. Joy is allowed within limits. You smile. Very small, very controlled. But yes, a smile. You wake up to the distinct smell of smoke piney sharp and entirely sanctioned. Not the kind of smoke that signals trouble. No. This is the gentle, regulated scent of a permitted domestic fire, attended, of course, by someone with a fire license. You roll over on your straw tick and stretch as the day begins. Today you're headed somewhere a little different, less market stalls, more mortar and brick. It's time to visit the Puritan home, where morality meets architecture in a handshake that's somehow both wooden and judgmental. You make your way along a winding path bordered by short, evenly clipped hedges, no flare, no flare, no flare. And there it is, a modest boxy structure slouching under the weight of its own humility. This dear sleeper is a perfectly average 17th century Puritan house. 2 rooms, 1 chimney, and approximately 0 joy. The door creaks open with a sound like regret, and you step inside. The air smells of boiled linen and quiet disappointments. The interior is spare wooden beams, overhead a hearth made of stone, and furniture that could double as punishment equipment. You sit on a bench that immediately makes your spine regret its ambitions. Historians still argue whether the design of these homes was based more on necessity or philosophical aversion to comfort. You suspect both. The floors are unvarnished planks, the kind that squeak only when someone steps with too much confidence. On the far wall hangs a single decoration, a hand-inked proverb that reads, "Pride leaves the hearth cold." You're offered a meal thick porridge served in a pewter bowl without ornament. The spoon is carved from horn and has been passed down for 5 generations, each one sanding off a little more joy. No salt, of course, not because it's unavailable, but because taste is a slippery slope. Once you flavor your gruel, who knows where it ends? Dancing laughter color. You chew slowly, respectfully. The family you're visiting sits around you in total silence. Conversation, it turns out, is not banned, but it is highly discouraged unless it involves confession scripture or domestic maintenance. Eventually, the patriarch clears his throat and says, "The rain was pious last night." Everyone nods. That's the high point of discussion. In this home, as in most furniture, is both functional and deeply symbolic. The main chest where linens are kept is also the reflection box. If you feel an emotion, you write it on a strip of parchment and slip it inside. The family reads them aloud at the end of the week, except the happy ones. Those are burned, quietly, and only if approved. In the corner stands a modest crib built with all the cheer of a gallows. Baby toys none. Children in Puritan homes are expected to begin absorbing Calvinist theology somewhere between teething and toddling. Instead of rattles, they get mini sermons carved onto wooden sticks. You pick one up. It reads, "Thou art not the center of anything." Lovely. You make your way upstairs, just a narrow ladder really, and enter the sleeping loft. Here, straw ticks lie in rows like moralizing pancakes. There are no pillows, just folded cloths. No blankets, just chill-damp fortitude. Above one bed is scratched a crude sun with a line through it. You're told it marks the place where merriment once slept. No one talks about it. As you head back downstairs, you pass the scolding chair. Not for children, this one is for adults. When someone expresses excessive emotion like pride, sarcasm, or visible contentment, they sit here for a prescribed duration. A wooden hourglass nearby tracks the time. Sometimes the family sings a low atonal hymn while someone is seated. It's both correction and ambiance. Of course, no Puritan home is complete without its modesty hooks wooden pegs by the door where you hang sinful garments. These might include cloaks with trim, stockings of any discernible color, caps with jaunty brims. You glance at your own shoes, a little too polished. A child stares at them, then whispers, "Your reflection is prideful." You thank her. Now it's time for the tour of the prayer room, which is also the pantry, which is also the study, which is also where arguments happen in controlled tones. In one corner sits a stack of acceptable books. One title catches your eye. 6 Ways to Fold, Linen Without Inviting Sin. This is not satire. Behind the pantry shelves lies a hidden alcove, the contrition closet. It's a small space barely the size of a cupboard where one might sit and consider their behavior in candlelight. You notice the candle is not lit. It can only be used after a formal apology. Here, families keep their guilt ledger, a household journal in which each member records their daily failings. Some entries include, spoke with vigor, dreamed vividly, was complimented on carpentry and said thank you with inflection. You are invited to add your own. You write, considered a second bowl of porridge. The father nods in solemn approval. Later in the day, you're led out to the moral garden. It's not about beauty, it's about labor. Rows of root vegetables, trellises of modest vines, and absolutely no decorative flowers. One family was once fined for cultivating sunflowers. Too tall, too cheerful. The garden is maintained by strict rhythm. You may hoe, till, or harvest, but never hum while doing so. A woman once hummed near a turnip bed and had to write a community letter of apology. A small plaque by the gate reads, growth is duty, bloom is temptation. Chickens roam, but they are not named. Naming animals is discouraged lest attachments form. You remember the goat from the marketplace. Praise not pet. As evening approaches, you re-enter the house to witness evening instruction. This is a sacred time where the family gathers to read a predetermined passage from Scripture, followed by a solemn moment. During the moment, everyone must face the hearth and consider mortality. If someone coughs, the moment resets. Tonight's passage from Leviticus, of course. Afterward, the eldest son shares the week's modesty report. It's a record of observed potential prideful acts by other family members, read aloud with care and no glee. This week's highlights. Mother sang twice while scrubbing. Father whistled after fixing the roof. Sister smiled with her eyes. Each person receives their notes with a nod. There is no defense, only self-awareness. And then, bedtime. You lie on your straw tick, staring at the dark beams above. The fire dies, slowly casting long shadows that look a bit like caution. Someone begins to recite the nightly affirmation. Today was endured. Tomorrow will be likewise. Thank God. Everyone responds amen with the cadence of surrender. As the household drifts off to sleep, you hear the scratch of someone updating the guilt ledger in the dark. The last sound you catch before sleep claims you is the distant hoot of an owl, swiftly followed by a child whispering. Even the owl knows restraint. You smile, only a little. Morning again. But not just any morning. This one begins with the rhythmic thud of a staff on packed earth. You follow the sound outside to discover the village's official warden of wakes pacing the main lane. He taps the ground once for each hour past dawn. 3 slow thuds. Time to rise, time to obey, time to behave. Today's subject, courtship and marriage in Puritan New England, which, spoiler alert, contains very little romance and exactly 0 candlelit walks through flower-filled meadows. No, this is a world where even wooing comes with strict guidelines, chaperone audits, and a healthy sprinkling of Old Testament guilt. You begin your journey standing beneath a structure known as the meeting bench, placed precisely between 2 family homes. This is where potential suitors may sit 3 feet apart, eyes forward, speaking only under intent of union supervision. The town's elder of courtship matters a man whose hobbies include glowering and record-keeping watches discreetly from the nearby prayer arbor. He carries a measuring rod just in case someone leans a bit too close. Your guide, a young woman named Thankfulness, tells you she's been visited upon the bench by Obadiah twice this month, once under overcast skies, once during moderate sunlight. Very romantic. She says he didn't blink too often. It was comforting. You try not to swoon. Courtship in this world is less about chemistry and more about doctrinal compatibility. Families exchange sheets, not bed sheets, mind you, but parchment forms with headings like temperament under trial, chasteness report, likelihood of false jest. Historians still argue whether these forms were formal requirements or more like strong suggestions passed around with the passive-aggressive force of divine mandate. Regardless, people filled them out with the fervor of people hoping not to marry heretics. Once mutual interest is declared and elder permission obtained, the couple may participate in bundling. Now don't get excited, this isn't as spicy as it sounds. Bundling is the practice of allowing 2 betrothed individuals to sleep in the same bed, fully clothed, separated by a bolted board, a thick seam of quilts, and ideally the Holy Spirit. Sometimes one or both are sewn into their bedclothes for extra moral reinforcement. It's less about intimacy and more about trust and also surveillance. Mothers might sit just outside the door, knitting loudly to discourage movement. You're shown a replica bundling bed at the town exhibit. It has labels. Do not cross zone. Elders observe here panel. A stitched pillow, reading stay ye upon thy side. You lie down for a moment, the mattress lumpy and whisper judgy. You get up quickly. Once courtship passes all moral inspections, the couple may proceed to marriage, a sacred institution marked by its simplicity. No bouquets, no white dresses, no awkward toasts. The ceremony takes place not in a church, but in the home, often in the largest room beside a fire that must burn modestly. There is no music, no dancing, and definitely no throwing of rice or petals. The officiant is usually a magistrate, not a minister. After all, the Puritans viewed marriage as a civil contract, not a holy sacrament. It's a practical arrangement, not an ecstatic union. You witness a reenactment. The groom wears his best woolen coat, the bride her least stained apron. They stand stiffly. The magistrate reads aloud the legal vows. Everyone nods soberly. No one claps. A chicken squawks somewhere in the distance, but even it seems subdued. Then comes the joining of labors, a ritual where the couple demonstrates their readiness by performing a chore together. Sometimes they churn butter, sometimes they sweep. Once a particularly expressive couple stacked logs side by side and were nearly censured for suggestiveness. The night of the wedding. Oh, it's not quite what you're picturing. Remember that bolt of cloth separating the betrothed during bundling. On the wedding night, it's removed slowly, but only after a long, silent prayer, and sometimes the recitation of Psalm 101 in its entirety. And don't even think about wedding night celebrations with friends. The couple is expected to retire in total privacy and emerge the next morning looking well-rested, but not too well-rested. That would imply excess. Now on to married life. Puritan couples had clear roles. The husband was the head of the household, a position akin to a local lord crossed with a referee. He worked, prayed, and occasionally delivered formalized affection, though never on the Sabbath. The wife managed the home, raised the children, and made sure no one was experiencing too much delight. There were even rules for spousal communication. Address one another by first name only in private. Never speak of affection in front of children. And disagreements would let us reflect further apart. In one famous case, a woman complimented her husband's carpentry in front of a neighbor. She was required to bake plain bread for 3 days. As penance, no yeast, no salt, no joy. Still, there was tenderness, though it was coded carefully. One surviving letter reads, "Though the Lord has given you a countenance of sternness, I find comfort in thy industrious brow." Basically, you look tired, and I like that about you. Another reads, "I hope the turnips grew large as your words lingered with me like uncut hay." That one might have been considered racy. Children followed quickly, both biologically and theologically. A marriage was expected to produce offspring, not just for population, but for piety. Every child was a potential tiny saint, or if unruly, a regrettable theological experiment. Couples were advised to never laugh during childbirth, even if the baby looked funny. Laughter invited vanity. Instead, they were to respond with solemn gratitude and perhaps a commemorative psalm. Birth announcements, when issued, included weight of the child, degree of noisiness, number of immediate spiritual concerns. Once a baby was described as afflicted with an overly cheerful eye. He was baptized twice. Of course, not every marriage thrived. Some faltered under the weight of silent tension and mutual piety, but divorce, nearly unthinkable. A couple might separate only under severe circumstances, abandonment, heresy, or persistent, disrespectful silence. You read about one case in which a woman refused to say amen with sufficient vigor. Her husband lodged a formal grievance. The community responded by assigning them both a week of observation chores, where they worked side by side in the presence of an elder who occasionally rang a small bell of correction. Historians still debate whether the bell had any real authority or was just an effective guilt amplifier. Remarriage was permitted especially in cases of widowhood. But even then, there was protocol. A man must wait an appropriate span, usually measured in seasons, not weeks. One man remarried just 6 months after his wife's death and was accused of hasty fondness. He defended himself by stating the goats needed her influence. It didn't help. In your final moments, shadowing this structured life of love and labor, you're taken to the bench of reflected union, a weathered plank beside the town's single willow tree. Married couples sit here once per season to consider their covenant. Sometimes they hold hands through gloves, of course. You sit for a moment yourself, letting your eyes trace the carved initials of 100 careful couples. Beside one set of letters is the phrase, "Together in purpose, mild in manner." And you realize that's kind of beautiful in a deeply beige, self-regulated way. The sun begins to dip and a cool breeze rustles the willow. A couple passes by, their hands not touching but their steps perfectly in sync. You smile, only slightly. You awake not to birdsong, but to the gentle, repetitive scratching of quills, like the murmured gossip of 1,000 soft rules being born. Today's journey is into the world of education and learning in 17th century Puritan New England, a place where reading is a divine duty, writing is a moral test, and laughter in the margins is absolutely forbidden. The Puritans, you see, didn't just believe in literacy, they weaponized it. In their view, illiteracy wasn't just inconvenient, it was practically satanic. After all, how could you read the Bible if you couldn't read, and how could you be saved if you didn't read the Bible? That's right, welcome to school, kiddo. Your eternal soul is riding on your penmanship. You step into a small, drafty, one-room schoolhouse, the kind that smells of damp ink, damp wood, and damp children. The air has a faint note of despair, like a room full of young minds stretching just a little too hard under the weight of theological grammar. A sharp-eyed woman at the front of the room, Mistress Temperance, is today's schoolmaster. Yes, master. The title is universal, regardless of gender, and it comes with all the severity of a freshly carved birch switch. You find a place on a bench that's more splinter than seat, and your fellow students glance at you with curiosity and mild suspicion. Newcomers are expected to recite a psalm within the first hour, or at least correctly spell iniquity. No pressure. On the wall hangs a battered copy of the New England Primer, a book every Puritan child knows before they know their own reflection. It starts cheerfully enough. Hey, in Adam's fall we sinned all. There's also Xerxes did die, and so must I. Encouraging stuff. Even the alphabet is drenched in morality. Letters become little sermons. You learn that C is for Christ who bled, and J is not for Jelly Bean, it's for Judgment Day. Mistress Temperance begins the lesson by holding up a horn book, a wooden paddle with a printed sheet of letters and prayers pasted on, covered with a thin sheet of transparent horn. It looks like something you'd find on a pirate ship, but in this world, it's a sacred tool. You're told to recite from it, loudly but not joyfully. There is a fine line. A typical school day is rigidly structured. Morning psalms, reading from the Bible or primer, penmanship practice. Thy why is too proud, says Mistress Temperance, copying moral aphorisms, arithmetic reluctantly. By noon, you've copied Idle Hands or the Devil's Workshop 17 times. Your hand aches. Your soul still suspect. You glance at your neighbor's slate. It reads, "Be thou not slothful." His eyes widen when he catches your gaze. "That was for yesterday's nap," he whispers. Lunch is plain bread and cold water, both earned, not guaranteed. A student once bragged about his mother's honey cakes and was made to wear the garment of temptation, a woolen smock with pockets too deep. You're not sure what it means, but it's deeply unsettling. Afternoons are for refined reading, where older students read aloud from approved texts, usually sermons or histories of martyrdom. Nothing perks up a Wednesday like the torment of the just or a faithful account of dying chastely. Still, despite the dreary flavor, Puritans were ahead of their time in valuing education, particularly female literacy, which for the 1600s is a surprisingly progressive stance. The logic was simple: mothers must teach children, and one cannot teach if one cannot read. So girls were taught to read, though rarely to write. Writing implied expression. Expression in turn implied danger. Historians still debate whether this was a practical concession or a cleverly disguised attempt at social control. Either way, the result was a generation of women who could read every word of Lamentations but not sign their own name on a letter of complaint. Education extended beyond the schoolroom, too. Puritan children were expected to memorize catechisms at home, long question-and-answer drills designed to embed doctrine into the brain with all the subtlety of a hammer. A common dinner ritual: "Father, what is the chief end of man-child? To glorify God and enjoy Him forever." Mother, pass the beans quietly. You visit the town's grammar school reserved for older boys preparing for Harvard. Yes, that Harvard, founded in 1636 to ensure ministers were properly trained. Back then, its motto might as well have been, "Less fun, more Latin." Students at grammar school studied Latin, Greek, logic, and theology with textbooks so dense they could double as cudgels. The walls are bare, save for a large sign that reads, "Knowledge without virtue is wind." And just to be clear, wind is not a compliment here. You sit in on a class reciting Lily's Latin grammar, the go-to guide for parsing classical sentences without smiling. A student stumbles on a verb conjugation and is asked to stand in the pillar of thought, a chalk circle in the corner, where one must reflect until they feel worthy to try again. One day a boy fainted in the pillar. They praised him for his humility. Writing materials are precious ink is made from oak galls. Pens are carved quills, and paper is reused until it resembles tissue from an ancient saint's pocket. Students are taught to sharpen quills carefully, both to conserve materials and because a dull pen reflects a dull heart. There's even a regional punishment for lazy handwriting, the script of shame. It's when you must write out your errors in full ornate cursive and then decorate the borders with biblical warnings. The scribes of sorrow, as some kids call it. You examine a collection of surviving student manuscripts. One includes, "I misspelled sanctification. I am small. My letters leaned left. That is vanity. I enjoyed writing. That was wrong." Some towns also operated dame schools, informal learning sessions held in the kitchens of literate women, usually for very young children. Picture a cramped room filled with toddlers trying to recite Genesis while not knocking over the soup pot. It's adorable. It's chaotic. It smells like turnips. In one surviving account, a woman named Goodwife Mercy taught 12 children in her front room while nursing twins' boiling socks and reciting scripture from memory. She reportedly expelled a 4-year-old for unrepentant frolic. Punishments for school misbehavior were naturally instructional. They included wearing the tongue bit, a small wooden dowel held between the teeth to prevent chat, sitting on the still stool for demonstrating ambition, copying Proverbs 22:15 until humility seeped in. And don't even think about laughing. A boy once giggled during arithmetic and was assigned the task of stone counting alone in the woods. No one knows what that entailed, but he came back very quiet. Still, the Puritan education system had its victories. Children learned to read young, read often, and carried that literacy into adulthood. The colony had an astonishingly high literacy rate for the era. By some accounts, over 90% of white male adults could read. Of course, what they read was limited. Approved materials included the Bible King James or Geneva, sermons by reputable ministers, the occasional herbal manual for practicality, not pleasure. Fiction was dangerous. Poetry was suspect. Novels were utterly forbidden. One town confiscated a traveler's copy of The Fairy Queen for excessive imagination. Yet some children found ways to sneak joy between the lines. You hear whispers of a group who secretly carved riddles into the underside of the pew benches. One reads, "What his pages never speaks, and yet can damn thee in one look." Answer the margin. You smile. Only a little. As the school day ends, you're invited to the annual Catechism Bee, a high-stakes event where children compete to recite theology faster than the others. No prizes, just public pride and a seat closer to the fire next week. You watch as one child recites all 107 questions of the Westminster Shorter Catechism without blinking. The room nods with slow approval. Somewhere, a mother weeps quietly from joy or fatigue. It's hard to tell. You leave the schoolhouse under a gray sky, the scent of ink and discipline still clinging to your sleeves. On a nearby post, a notice reads, "Children shall learn as if watched by the Lord himself," and also Mistress Temperance. You believe it. The night falls thick and muffled across the village commons, as if even the stars are tiptoeing around the Puritans. You walk slowly now, your shoes caked with dry soil, your brain brimming with leftover catechisms and the faint echo of recited Latin. But there's one last corner of this odd rule-bound world to visit before you drift off the realm of law enforcement and punishment, where justice isn't just blind, it's also wearing a very itchy woolen hood. You follow the rhythm of wooden shoes down a packed dirt lane to the heart of colonial control, the Meeting House. It's a severe-looking building, more fortress than sanctuary, where sermons and sentences are handed out in equal measure. And trust me, if you were a Puritan in trouble, you probably met your fate on the same bench you heard last Sunday's sermon about eternal brimstone. Outside the door stands the constable, a role part-town cop, part repentance monitor, and full-time wet blanket. His name might be something like Ezekiel or Obadiah, and he always looks mildly disapproving, even when you're just breathing. His job to enforce laws that read like they were written by someone who lost a bet with joy. Some real gems from the Puritan codebooks. No unnecessary walking on the Sabbath. No wearing lace unless you earned at least $200 a year. No public laughter after sunset. No kissing your spouse in public. Yes, even that spouse. Historians still argue whether these laws were genuinely enforced or simply existed as scarecrows meant to keep the public in line without constant action. But either way, you knew the constable was always watching. He saw you pet your dog with a little too much affection. He heard you whistle after dinner. He filed it all away in his mental book of slightly suspicious things. And if you did break a law intentionally or accidentally, you'd meet a parade of deeply creative punishments. Let's begin with the stocks. You probably know them from cartoons. A wooden frame holds your hands and head while passers-by throw cabbage at you. But in 17th century New England, they weren't symbolic. They were Wednesday afternoon entertainment. Spend an hour in the stocks, and you'd be subjected to everything from heckling to light snow collection on your head. One poor fellow was caught uttering exclamations during a thunderstorm and spent a soggy day contemplating his volume issues. For crimes involving vanity, the punishment often involved accessories. Too fond of silk gloves, you might be forced to wear a paper version in public with veins scrawled across the fingers. Too fancy with your hairstyle. A man once had to wear a wig, fashioned from goat hair, for a month. Your favorite, the dunce whirl, where minor moral offenders wore a spinning signboard on their shoulders labeled with their offense. One woman's red, lingered in bed, past cock crow. Harsh. Then there was the ducking stool, a chilling little contraption stationed by the river. It was technically used to punish scolds, women who gossiped too freely, or heaven forbid disagreed too loudly. The accused was strapped into a chair attached to a long wooden beam and dunked into the cold river over and over until her spirit was properly cooled. Historians still debate how often this was actually used versus just threatened, but it left a cultural scar. The phrase, "don't stir," the ducking stool lingered for decades as a warning to watch your tone. Men weren't exempt either. A gossiping man might be sentenced to wear a carved wooden tongue on a leather strap around his neck. A man caught selling spirits without prayer had to wear a keg lid strapped to his chest with the words "Lordless Drink" painted in ash. And then there were the whippings, a more direct route to righteousness. In the town square stood a stout post with a ring of rope and the inevitable bloodstain. A sentence of 10 lashes was considered modest, 20 character building. Anything more, and you'd better hope your neighbors liked you enough to intervene. Witnesses were encouraged. Public shame was part of the justice. But don't get too smug. Cheering during another's punishment could earn you a place beside them. The goal wasn't cruelty, at least not officially, but purification. You sinned. You paid. You emerged ideally scrubbed clean. Some towns added flair. One favored the shame mask, a metal helmet shaped like a pig's head, or devil's snout with a bell attached. The wearer was led around the square while the bell rang mournfully. Great acoustics. Terrible optics. There's also the fascinating case of the cursing stool, a punishment for blasphemy. The offender had to sit on a cold wooden block during service wearing a sign that said, "I spoke ill of the Almighty." You weren't allowed to look at anyone or participate. It was like theological timeout, except your eternal soul was on the line. In another town, a man was fined for wearing bright blue socks on a Sunday. Not only was he forced to pay, but he also had to walk barefoot for a week to demonstrate humility. Kids followed him chanting, Blue foot, it's petty." It's ridiculous. It happened. Not all punishments were physical. Some were architectural. You passed by the pillory slightly taller than the stocks with slots for the head and arms. Offenders stood there for hours, pelted with whatever locals had lying around. Spoiled fruit pine cones, aggressive glances. Someone once threw an onion. The smell lingered for weeks. You also spot the cage, a human-sized bird cage hung from a pole. Offenders, usually those who cheated in trade or skipped church, were hoisted up and left swinging in the wind. The creaking sound was said to remind others of the consequences of earthly imbalance. There's the whispering corner in one meeting house, a brick nook, where known gossipers had to stand with their backs to the room during service. If they whispered to each other, there it counted double. And sometimes the punishment was tailored. A man who insulted the town midwife was forced to carry a mock baby made of stone for a week, cradling it properly, or facing a fine. The object even had a name, Justice Pebble. Still, Puritan justice wasn't all sticks and shame. There were some early attempts at restorative justice, believe it or not. In some towns, you could choose to confess publicly and ask for forgiveness instead of facing harsher punishment. One woman's heartfelt apology for Sabbath breaking reportedly moved an entire congregation to tears and a warm loaf of bread. There were even rules for the judges themselves. A magistrate caught accepting a gift before sentencing could be stripped of office and made to write out the entire book of Proverbs by hand, twice, with ink made from boiled blackberry roots. Despite the zeal, the system had cracks. People began to question it. Town meetings grew louder. Petitions appeared. One anonymous letter read, "Mercy is not weakness. A people in fear cannot walk in grace." Scandalous stuff. It was burned. But gradually things softened. Laws eased. Stocks broke down. Some of the sillier fines were repealed, and new generations grew weary of the old punishments. One young minister described the pillory as an embarrassment to the righteous. Still, the echoes remain. You can't help but glance over your shoulder as you walk through the quiet streets, half expecting to see a judge, a constable, or even a particularly stern grandmother watching you from a window. And now, as the last section draws to a close, you pause. The wind has softened, the night is still, and this strange little world of stern rules and stranger consequences begins to fade like smoke from a dying candle. So let's slow our breath, let our thoughts dissolve into the quiet hush, and move into the final wind down. You lie still now, warmed by the fire's faint glow, your mind weaving back through the sleepy corridors of Puritan New England, each odd law, each creaky punishment, each prim and dusty rule falling behind like leaves in the wind. You feel the old wood of the stocks fade from your memory, the scratch of quills softening to silence, the rustle of worn sermons becoming distant as dreams. What once seemed strict and unyielding now drifts gently into something else entirely, a slow rhythm, a lull, a hum of order that no longer binds but comforts. Outside, the moon hangs like a candle in the sky, flickering quietly above thatched roofs and shuttered windows. There's no whisper of judgment now, no clatter of the ducking stool, no shame masks left swinging in the wind. Just breath, just stillness, just rest. Let your body grow heavier with each moment. Let the oddities of old laws settle like dust at your feet. You've walked through a world where silence was sacred, laughter was rationed, and every action echoed with meaning. But here, now there is nothing you must do, no lesson to recite, no confession to make. Just lie back. Let the soft hush of long-ago voices sing you into sleep, not with psalms, but with peace. The journey is over. The rules are resting, and so are you.